Ron, just so you know, that's not for amplification, it's just for recording.
Okay.
You won't hear your voice.
Okay, good. So let me just do it this way. I guess I'll give you 4 categories because I can't cover every discipline. So let's just take science, people in the sciences, engineering, let's go medical field, and I can do there, but let's do everything else, okay? Sorry about that, but let's raise your hands if you're science. Okay, that's an idea. Okay, engineering. Oh boy, okay. All right, and then I said medicine, medical field of some kind, could be nursing, any medical, okay, a little bit of that, and then everything else? Okay, all right. Okay, and you're all basically going to University of Michigan? Not entirely, okay. A lot of you are. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I grew up in northern Minnesota. Most of my time was northern Minnesota, so I consider Ann Arbor to be the tropics compared to what we had up there. Okay, I grew up. We had the phenomenon called the square tires. You know what that is? What it was is I'd get up in the morning. My mom would take me when I was young, take me out in the car, and the car would go thump, 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 thump. And that's because overnight the tires were sitting on one side, and it basically froze the rubber, hardened the rubber into one flat surface, and it would take about 10 minutes to get round tires, okay? So things were pretty cold up there. I went to the University of Minnesota. I became a serious Christian, or maybe Christian period, when I was a freshman. I encountered a group there that was serious about the Bible. I didn't know how serious, so when I got into it, they invited me to a Bible study. At the time, I wanted to learn everything about everything. I just wanted to soak up knowledge. And I thought about scholars sitting around pondering the Bible, and it turned out that when I got there, they did ponder the Bible, but they also were seriously, they had made Jesus Christ the center of their lives, and they were seriously transformed by it, and their meaning came from that, and they had tremendous joy and enthusiasm. And it was presented to me as a choice to follow Christ and basically make him the Savior for my sins and to obey him. And I didn't know if I believed this. I didn't know how serious I would be about it. But I just decided that if God was God, and if this was, that I couldn't possibly go wrong by giving my life to God and deciding to follow him. So that's cutting the story very short. But it gets to the next point, which was I was studying chemical engineering. And I fairly quickly felt science tells us what's true. Why would we ever look to religion for truth? And you see this in books that come out. There was one by somebody named Sam Harris, The End of Faith. It's basically saying not only is faith believing in something that we don't have good evidence for, but it actually produces a lot of the evil in the world. So this has been a continuous trend, continuous theme, and at the university, I felt that all around me. I felt most of the professors were not believers, most of the students were not. So this became a kind of a challenge to me to figure out, was I doing something wrong? How do I integrate what I'm pursuing in my studies, which is grounded on science? My first 2 years in college were chemistry, physics, mathematics, okay? And I've learned since that there's a name for this basic concept. Here we go. And it's called positivism. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It's a branch of philosophy, and this is just a pretty good summary of it. What science cannot discover, mankind cannot know. It's not often said as succinctly as that, but the idea is if it's not science, you can't believe it. It's belief, it's something that's soft, it's not rigorously true. So that's what I'm going to address today in various ways. So here's another statement of it. This is actually the definition of it from a dictionary. It's a philosophical doctrine contending that sense perceptions are the only admissible basis of human knowledge and precise thought. So you take the input in, take the data in, you reason with it, and that's the only way to come to legitimate conclusions. So that has immediate implications to theology, this is a statement by one of the preeminent philosophers following this, this concept. There is a God is an empty claim, neither true nor false, since there's no conceivable way to verify its truth by sense perceptions. Okay, so you can't see it, you can't experience it directly, so you should reject it, and this is made very explicit by this mathematician. It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Actually, this philosophy has had some hard times recently because there's an inherent contradiction in this statement, that it, as stated in such an absolute form at least. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to what would cause a problem with this statement? Yeah? Exactly, right? You see how it turns on itself? So you would have to say, except for this statement, right? And that's kind of weak tea, right, to do that. So this positivism is not as strongly held, but it still permeates science. You get this sense that scientists feel we have the real information. This other stuff is not to be taken seriously. So what I'm going to talk about, since I'm not a philosopher, I'm going to talk about the writings of two philosopher-scientists, Michael Polanyi, who was a primarily 20th century philosopher and scientist, and Blaise Pascal, and see what they have to say about this. So I'll give you a little bit of background of Polanyi first, and then we'll look at his viewpoint. So first of all, he summarized his philosophy in this book, which I encourage you to read, Personal Knowledge. This was an eye-opener for me. And it basically broadens the idea of knowledge. So you ask the question, what is knowledge? And you could narrow it and say, if it's not science, it's not knowledge. It's just opinion, speculation, has to be science, or it's not even qualify as knowledge. He resisted that, and he generated a set of principles that spread knowledge out into many areas. And we're going to talk about just a few of these. So there's knowledge in many places, not just science. In fact, science itself is not really possible without a broader view of knowledge. So just to give you his background a little bit, he was born in Hungary, and he had 4 careers. He was a medical doctor, then a physical chemist, social thinker, and then philosopher. Leaving medicine early for the attraction of scientific research, he achieved international recognition in other fields. His talent and breadth of knowledge made him a polymath, that is good in many fields, prepared him for the philosophical creativity that crowned his life with a vision and proposal for a new theory of knowledge, a theory intended to save scientific culture from its own self-destruction by its dehumanized notion of objective detachment. Okay, so he's attacked positivism. So he resigned his position in 1933 with the rise of Nazism, and he was able to land another position in England, and he went there with his wife and 2 sons. His wife was herself an able chemist, and their 2 sons, George and John, became respectively an economist, a quite well-known economist, and then a physical chemist who won the Nobel Prize. So this is a bright family. So let's start out with his first principle. It's called tacit knowledge, and he sums it up by this phrase, we know more than we can tell. This is a pre-logical phase of knowing, and it encompasses a range of information that you take in. And a simple way to illustrate that is to consider how you learn to ride a bicycle or play catch with your son or daughter. And you don't explain it, you don't learn it by studying biomechanics, right? Right? You might get some information there, but you learn it by doing it. And you can't really even explain exactly how it is that you're riding a bicycle. And if somebody wants to test that presumption, I don't recommend this, been told that if you get on a bicycle and switch your hands like this and try to ride it, you'll find out very quickly that You don't know the biomechanics of how you're writing it. You've learned to write it with something that we sometimes call muscle memory. So no star athlete can explain how she does what she does in words anywhere near sufficient for somebody else to do the same thing, right? So this is tacit knowledge, and it is knowledge. It's just that we can't explain it in words exactly. Now, it's the same thing when you get to science or medicine. You have to do to really know in detail. So an example might be if you're going to go in for surgery, right, and you have a choice of two surgeons. One has read and even written textbooks on surgery, say all the best textbooks, but has never done surgery or watched it being done. And the other one has not read a single book, but was trained by an expert to do surgery. Which one would you want to go under the knife of, right? So it's that knowledge that you can only pick up by seeing and doing yourself, that it cannot even be explained in words, no matter how much space you're given in the journals to describe it. It won't be possible for you to communicate all of that knowledge. To say it's not knowledge is to say that that surgeon didn't gain anything by that apprenticeship under the master. So even communication, by the way, feel free to interrupt and ask questions. I want this to be as open as possible, okay? So, and I don't have to get through all the material, so if you want to engage, just ask, okay? So even communication requires this sort of tacit knowledge. So you can look up a word in a dictionary if you don't know what it means, but of course, how does it define it? With other words, right? So it's infinite regress. So Polanyi observes any process of articulation inevitably relies upon that which is not articulated. Can't be articulated. Indeed, reliance upon what is not articulated is how words become meaningful. Meaning is not reducible to a set of rules. You pick it up through other experiences. You understand what a word means by hearing it used. And in some mysterious process, we get a sense of what the meaning is. And we can't explain that in words, right? Because we can't define all of our words. It's not reducible in this way. If you go to the most explicit, most rigorous field there is, mathematics, even there, tacit knowledge is required. The professor's deriving something on the board, you're constantly using your tacit knowledge to interpret it. So you start getting a derivation, and the professor doesn't have to say that that second X in the second line is the same as in the first line, even though it looks a little bit different. He's drawing it on the board. You're constantly using all of your tacit knowledge, all sorts of things you're bringing to bear to be able to interpret what's going on with the math. So algebra cannot be reduced to a set of formal rules. All types of knowledge, however pure, consist in part of tacit rules which may be impossible to formulate in principle. So let me give you an example. Here's an exam, math exam. You're told to find x. Can you find x? Yeah, you've seen this before. The student puts this on, find x, right? All right, so he lacks tacit knowledge when he did that, right? Okay, so this is a New Testament concept as well. This is from Romans. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know how to pray as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes with us with sighs too deep for words. So our communication with God articulated how you do this. You can look at the chemistry and so forth, but there's not a rigorous science of this. It has to be experienced to know what's good and not good. To say that there's no knowledge in connoisseurship is to say that the beginner picking up the violin is just as good as the expert playing in the orchestra, right? Obviously not true. So there's knowledge there that is not of the normal scientific kind of knowledge. And the Bible has this kind of knowledge too. Taste and see that the Lord is good. when Jesus was introduced, I think it was Philip said, Nazareth, can anything good come from there? Oh, that was Nathaniel, sorry. Come and see, said Philip. Experience. Something to be experienced. Then there's community. Scientists cooperate with each other. They self-coordinate. And he drew the example of a marketplace where people can buy and sell, and they freely engage. They decide what to sell and for what price and so forth. And similarly, science cannot be organized from the top down. Scientists work together voluntarily. If anybody tries to organize everything that they do, that's been tried, places like the Soviet Union, and they end up producing bogus science. So it's a self-organized process. It involves community. Then there's what's called the fact-value distinction, that sometimes it's said, well, science deals with facts, religion deals with values. There's some truth to that, but both of them have some of the other. You cannot completely separate them. So here's an example from science. This was a distinguished German physicist, Friedrich Kohlrausch, that said what matters is measuring accurately. He, in terms of natural science, said he would be pleased to determine accurately the speed of water running through a gutter. And completely misjudge the nature of scientific value, for the accuracy of an observation does not make it valuable to science. Who cares what the speed was of that water in a gutter? So you have to care about something before it has any value. In fact, so I would say meaning comes before truth. So, for example, we could study this tabletop and give you the dimensions exactly, what it's made out of. We could talk about that. It could be all exact, precise, right? What you care about. Meaning is what matters, and it matters very greatly in science as well. In fact, I tell my students this, I think Christina probably will remember this, that being wrong in science is the first step to being right. What matters is, first of all, is that you're addressing an important question. You're tackling something, and you can get it wrong, but it's better to be wrong about something important than right about something trivial. So I'll illustrate this. I teach fluid mechanics, and when I get to Newton's laws, early on, F equals ma, I go to the history of it. And the physics started in some ways, important ways, with Aristotle. He had a system of physics. He talked about gravity. He talked about why some things go down and other things go up. His chemistry consisted of 4 elements, so his chemistry is pretty bad. Air, water, fire, and earth, right? 4 elements. Okay, that's pretty bad chemistry. His physics was not any better. Okay, his physics was that the earthy things and the watery things go down, and the air and the fire go up, and they just want to go up, and the others want to go down. And he thought the earth was the center of the universe, and so these heavy things wanted to go to the center. Other things wanted to go away from the center. With respect to taking a ball and throwing it, you move it by pushing on it. When you let it go, why does it keep going? Because it cuts through the air comes around and pushes it from behind, okay, after it cuts through the air. You won't get any credit on my exams for that answer, okay? So he had very famous writings on this subject, and he was very influential, although wrong on his physics. One of the earliest people to challenge him was actually a theologian scientist named Philoponus. People don't know about him. He lived at a time when it was hard to do science. Grants were even harder to get in 529 than they are now. Okay, and he was attracted to refute Aristotle's views because Aristotle said that the universe was eternal. It had always existed. And he was a theologian who believed that God had created the universe at some point in the past. just as was stated in the Bible. So he ended up challenging Aristotle's entire philosophy. So he had these three principles. The universe is a product of one single God. The heavens and the earth are physical properties. That's very important. And the stars are not divine. At the time, planets like Jupiter, Saturn, Mars were thought to be gods. In fact, they have the name of gods. And he wanted to dethrone them. The Genesis account differed from other accounts of the universe, like the Greek account and so forth, in that it starts out with God only, and everything came from God. So you don't worship the moon, you don't worship the sun. These are material things. And Philoponus says they're made out of the kind of stuff that we have here on earth because God created all of it. So you're not to worship anything in the created order. Then he questioned Aristotle's view of dynamics and cosmology, and he got around to Aristotle's theory of motion, that continuation of motion depends on continued action of a force. So for the ball to keep going, the air has to push it. Philoponus said instead that a hurled body acquires a motive power or inclination for forced movement from the agent producing the initial motion. This power secures the continuation of such motion. In other words, he defined something that later was called impetus, that an object will continue to move on its own once you've impressed a force upon it. And that was developed through the Middle Ages. Eventually, Galileo developed it to a higher degree, and if you track the logic of it, it leads right up to Newton. It practically points to Newton. I go through the details in my class in fluid mechanics. I still respect Newton a lot, but he was his laws were pointed to very, very distinctly by all the predecessors that worked in science. So science can work by addressing an important question. You get it wrong, but you think hard about it. You're being wrong is only valuable if it's a thoughtful way of being wrong, right? If you thought about it, and it's a thoughtful way of being wrong, then others will address that, and they can benefit from your thought and figuring out exactly why you're wrong. This is how science, this took a long time to go from Aristotle. It was 1,500 years to get to the correct theory of momentum, the basic concept of momentum, which, by the way, still is an absolute concept in physics. Momentum conservation is still absolute in physics. So it gives you an idea of how much time is required, how much work is required, how much collaboration is required, how much interaction is required. It's an amazing process, and I think it's practically a miracle that we can do it. What I also say quite often is, if we were any dumber, we could not do science. Okay, we're just barely smart enough that working as hard as we can, working together over long periods of time in the right environment, we can do science, and it's a glorious thing. Okay, another issue that comes up is this fact-value distinction, and I alluded to it earlier. In every sphere of human endeavor, either there are real values and standards which men can recognize and to which they can freely subject themselves, or they are totally mistaken in thinking that there are such things and that they are freely serving them. If there are no such values and standards in a given sphere, then all practitioners of the activity in question, including science, are utterly mistaken about their own efforts. Their successes and failures, because there can be no such thing as success and failure in that activity if there aren't standards. So whatever it is, there are standards that you're pursuing. Otherwise, there's no success and there's no failure. So again, facts and values are interdependent. Science actually is a calling. This is the way Polanyi describes the calling to science. To hold such knowledge is an act deeply committed to the conviction that there is something there to be discovered. It is personal in the sense of involving the personality of him who holds it, and also in the sense of being, as a rule, solitary, but there's no trace of it in it of self-indulgence. The discoverer is filled with a compelling sense of responsibility for the pursuit of a hidden truth, which demands his services for revealing it. His act of knowing exercises a personal judgment in relating experience, evidence to an external reality, an aspect of which he is seeking to apprehend. So this is a calling. There's something out there that needs to be explained. And if you've participated in science, when you're on the hunt, you sense there's something there. You can't quite grasp it, but you have this feeling. There's an intuition. It can't be reduced to a prescriptive method. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. It's not that way. It's a sense that something there, and you start to pursue it because it needs to be brought to light. So let's get some faith. Polanyi saw absolute objectivity as a delusion and false ideal. He criticized the prevailing notion that the scientific method yields truth mechanically to the scientist. There's an automatic method. You just follow these rules, and you get to the result. Instead, he argued that all knowing is personal and as such relies upon fallible commitments. The fiduciary component, he called it. So his statement is that all knowledge contains a fiduciary component. So there's faith in all knowledge. You cannot avoid faith commitments. No matter how scientific it is, you can't avoid it. And this even applies to mathematics. So this is a rather amazing thing. I don't know if any of you have heard of Kurt Gödel, the mathematician. Very peculiar character, actually. If you read about him, was really a stunning intellect with an unusual personality. And he derived what are called Gödel's theorem, or theorems. And this is a summary of it from Wikipedia. The first theorem shows that there will always be statements about natural numbers. We're just talking now about numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that are true but unprovable within the system. So he proved that you cannot prove every true statement. He proved you can't prove. Shows that a system cannot demonstrate its own consistency. In other words, if you ask, could there be a contradiction in basic math? Could there be a contradiction? And he showed he wasn't able to prove there's no contradiction. He was able to prove that you can't prove that there's no contradiction. You see that? He does this by, well, very, very clever arguments. So even mathematics requires faith to accept its self-consistency. I believe mathematics is self-consistent, but you cannot prove that it is. So there's a fiduciary component, there's faith involved in everything. By the way, was a Christian, believed that it was personal and called his philosophy rationalistic, idealistic, optimistic, and theological. Or what he means completely about that. Constructed and having as an afterlife. Okay, there's an argument that actually Jesus made that is similar in some ways to Gödel's argument. Okay, he was confronted with a group of Jews called Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. They believed in God, but when you're dead, you're dead. And they challenged him with a kind of an argument to try to stump him about an afterlife. And it seemed like a really good argument to them. And Jesus knew that they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, which don't explicitly mention an afterlife. And he answered them using a statement from those first 5 books. I don't know if anybody remembers what he said on that when he was confronted that way. He quoted one of the first 5 books where God is speaking, saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. First he said, you err because you don't know the Scriptures and you don't know the power of God. God had said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then Jesus said, God is the God of the living, not of the dead. At first, I didn't realize how deep and important that argument was. They didn't understand even the parts of the Bible that they had, nor the power of God. He was saying that God's love for them was so great, his covenant with them was so great, that God in his power would not sever or end that relationship. He is the God of, and he's an eternal present. There's no way that he would let them just disappear forever, right? And so he's following this reasoning and confronted them with it, and it reminds me very much of Gödel saying that this is a rational thing to believe once you accept who God is, a loving being who wants a relationship with us and wants it very badly and wants it to be eternal. So this is how Jesus dealt with it. Polanyi was also a Christian. He took God as real and worship as important. He referred to the concept of salvation by grace as analogous to the process of scientific discovery. He regarded the relation between faith and reason as fundamental, was committed to restore the priority of belief even in science. He recalled the Augustinian statement, unless you believe, you don't understand. So you believe to understand. Okay, and you see something like this in Paul's writing, and you see the word know here. Now, knowledge is not just knowledge of facts, it's knowing people. And those of you in close relationships with, if you're married, or you have a girlfriend, or you have brothers, you have your parents, there's a knowledge there of that person that can't be reduced to just mere statements. So, and it involves faith, doesn't involve proof, but I think I know my wife and what she is likely to do and what she won't do. You have a knowledge that is real knowledge, but not reducible to science. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly. Should I stop here, or should I have maybe 5 minutes about Blaise Pascal? Should I go? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about him. If any of you are in science, the unit of pressure is called a Pascal. Pascal was a scientist. He was a brilliant mathematician. He started out doing games of chance. He was a gambler. And so he developed rules of statistics. Pascal's triangle is related to that. He was just brilliant. When he was 16 years old, he was already making mathematical breakthroughs, engaging in academic discourse with professional mathematicians. By age 19, he invented his own mechanical calculator. And this is in the 1600s. He sold 50 units of it. During his 20s and 30s, he did important work in mathematical probability, made discoveries related to fluids and pressure, and he gave us buses. Okay, this is a Paris bus drawn by horses. Noticing a crowd of people all headed in the same direction to work, he came up with the idea of the bus. And in 1662 formed the first bus company. Okay, really smart guy, you know. Okay, now there's this November 23rd, 1654. Pascal was at home alone. The sun was set and all was dark. He was most likely preparing for bed when suddenly at around 10:30 p.m. something supernatural happened. It's not clear exactly what he saw, but the amazing mystical experience lasted for a full 2 hours. As soon as it was over, he grabbed a pen and paper and wrote down what was swirling through his head. He then took the piece of paper with the story and carefully sewed it into the inside of his jacket, which he kept with him the rest of his life. He did not discover until his death. Unlike his first intellectual conversion, this conversion was of the heart, and it stuck. He mostly gave up his work in mathematics and devoted himself to theology and apologetics. Years later, he published his letters, Attack on Moral Casuistry, that became famous not only for its arguments, but also for its humor. Increasingly, Pascal deprived himself so that he could get more. He sold his coach and horses, his fine furniture and silverware, and even his library in order to give the proceeds to the poor. When he received an advance of 1,000 francs for his first bus, he sent the money to the poor in Blois, who had suffered a bitter winter. He then signed over his interest in the bus company hospitals of Paris and Clermont. When Pascal died at age 39, he was not in good health. He had health problems. His funeral was attended by family, friends, scientific colleagues, worldly companions, converts, and writers. The back of the church was filled with the poor. each and every person among them someone Pascal had helped. He wrote, "Let it not be imagined that a life of godliness must necessarily be a life of melancholy and gloominess, for a man only resigns some pleasures to enjoy others infinitely greater." When he died, what was written on the piece of paper was discovered. The coat was, they noticed something, they opened the coat, they took it out, and here's what was on the paper. The year of grace, 1654, fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not the philosophers and of the learned, certitude, feeling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ. And you can read, almost brings me to tears to think about what he was experiencing. And somehow he encountered the living God. He knew God in some personal, deep way that goes beyond what you can even articulate. And it utterly transformed him. Complete submission to Jesus Christ into my director, eternally enjoy for a day's exercise on the earth, and I forget your words, amen. That was Blaise Pascal. So let me stop there. I'll put up a biblical quote about knowing, culminates knowledge of God, who is Christ Jesus. That's the ultimate knowledge. Surpasses knowledge, as Paul puts it. So the main point is, if one consistently defines knowledge to include only, quote, objective science as true knowledge and to exclude faith and personal commitments, then all human endeavors, including science itself, collapse into meaninglessness. This is because all knowledge rests on a bedrock of tacit perceptions, feelings, and beliefs that form the context into which new knowledge must be integrated and from which science can never free us. Michael Polanyi not only rejected the absurd positivist reductionist view of science as common way, but also presented a vision that unites scientific knowledge with that in humanities, the arts, and theology, based on human passion for discovering universal knowledge and the ultimate knowledge of the one who loves us, that extends beyond what can be articulated by mere words. Blaise Pascal came to personally know the God who loved him and sacrificed his son for his knowing and beholding this God, giving up everything else. And I'm just going to leave you with questions to ponder, and I'll take any questions or thoughts that anybody might have. Thanks for your attention.